Well, this is unusual. Hello YouTube's Future Joy Boy here. This video was fully recorded before there was even spoilers for chapter 1114. Then the spoilers started to leak and I thought to myself, nah, let's just upload this after the chapter. Then the entire spoilers released and I realized something. I'm literally going to tell people in my review to wait for this video to come out before I talk about the mystery of the world, which is really just a stupid order of events the more that I think about it. This is what we want to talk about. I really should just unleash it. So we're doing it weird this week. So this video doesn't really contain spoilers for chapter 1114. It contains a detail, which I guess you could consider to be a spoiler, but it's really not that big. But I suppose that's my warning because I do mention one thing. But yeah guys, this theory is insanely good and I think that it works incredibly well with what I know about chapter 1114. So I'm just gonna give it to you as it was. So after One Piece chapter 1113, we now know that Vegapunk believes that the world might sink into the ocean. This is the conclusion of Vegapunk's message. Everything that he's gonna say in the next chapter, however many chapters it takes, it's all leading up to this reveal, an understanding of this process. So when you're thinking about how the world might potentially fall into the ocean, it's almost assured that in order to tackle this question, Vegapunk will reveal aspects of the One Piece world's geology, the mystery of how the world works, and some of the unexplained phenomena. Guys, the holes in Eni's lobby and now Lolosia, the knock-up stream, the Grand Line, Reverse Mountain, the Calm Belt, these are all on the table as things that might be explained here very shortly. We have been looking forward to this for so long. So guys, it goes without saying that I straight up do not know whether in the next chapter we will get answers. So this video could be proven false and a waste of time in a very short amount of time, but I promise you, I intend to contribute to the flood of videos talking about this. Carpe freaking diem, man, seize the day. So there are many possibilities as to how the world works in order to possibly theorize, speculate, how the world might sink. But today you're going to hear some things you have never heard before, and the reason we want to talk about it is because it is mind-blowingly hype. After you watch this video, you'll want this theory to be true. So make sure you're buckled up and subscribed. Let's begin. Hey YouTube, Joe Boy here. So, let's begin with something that I've already explained, because I think that it's true. In my first reaction, I offered up what I see to be definitive evidence that the water levels in the Grand Line are rising and have been rising for hundreds of years. Obviously, if you're talking about the sea level rising or the world sinking, the first thing that people are going to be thinking about is the Water 7 arc in Aqua Laguna. That was the big premise of that arc. That basically the city was being built atop the older city below because it was drowning. This is the first time I think that this idea was sort of planted in our minds, but we weren't 100% sure that it would become more. But I think that you need to realize that Water 7 is unique in not only the Grand Line, but the larger story. No island is sinking quite like Water 7 is. No other island is as drastic. So Water 7 might be experiencing the effect that Vegapunk intends to explain, but I think that there are other factors specific to Water 7 which makes it worse and more observable. So it's in the small detail that this picture starts to paint itself. This flooding may be occurring elsewhere, but it's simply too slow for people to realize. We saw Jaya as it was 400 years ago in Nolan and Kalgra's flashback. We saw Jaya as it was literally ripped apart due to the knock-up stream, and half of it landed in the Sky Islands where it exists today. But more specifically, as the island was ripped apart, there is a house that Oda chose to focus on that was ripped squarely in half. And 400 years ago, we get to see the coastline of where this house was. If you compare that coastline to the coastline of the present day house, which was where Cricket was living, you can see that water levels have risen. But this is probably not the most definitive example, because Oda drew us a picture explaining the process of how Wano, present day Wano, was created. These panels are literally stacked one on top of the other. Oda drew them at precisely the same time, and it shows us a time lapse from past Wano, 800 years ago or so, to now. So you can see how Wano was originally. You could see the walls put up around Wano, and then you see Wano as it is now. And if you compare the sea level drawn in these panels, it confirms that the water levels around Wano are higher than they once were. Basically, if you look at this picture, it confirms that the original Wano built on the surface of the island as it once was would have flooded anyway, not because of rainwater, but because of the actual sea level. So this naturally begs the question about Wano's wall. We're obviously assuming, or we have assumed, that the wall was a defense against people that might want to attack the island. But Maybe the people of Wano knew what was going to happen to their island. They knew that the sea would flood their world. So the wall was constructed to actually keep the sea out. And in a hilarious One Piece joke twist, they didn't realize that, hey, when you put the wall up so that the ocean can't get in, you trap the rainwater. So they flooded anyway. But they knew what was going to happen. And this might check out in other places, because if you look across the Grand Line, interesting concept is that castles of the various islands from Alabasta to Drum Island and even Dressrosa are built on top of mountains, perhaps suggesting that the kings who once ruled over these places were also aware of what might eventually happen. So they put their castles on the highest spots on their islands. Islands have been steadily drowning, and quite possibly in the distant past, there was more islands than exist today. I want you to look at Jinbei's cover story, where he found underwater ruins which contained a poneglyph. Guys, these ruins are essentially perfectly preserved. There's no damage to them. It's almost like the island, or the ruins were on an island that steadily flooded and then abandoned, to later become the home of sea creatures. And to add on to this, we don't know what happened to the original homelands of the fishmen and of the minks. Possibly their original islands are completely flooded as well. So the foreshadowing for the world flooding or sinking is definitely there. Now it's really just a question of why is this the case? I think that chapter 1114 gave us a very important clue: earthquakes. And this actually makes a ton of sense. When Imu's weapon destroyed the Lulsia and he describes the world sea levels rising by 1 meter, he says the cause of this is earthquakes. It's literally in the text. You may be wondering how earthquakes might cause the global sea level to rise. I think that I have an extremely good idea. In fact, it is the only idea that makes any sense to me whatsoever. I want to start abstract, and you'll understand how this will all come together when we get there. I am promising you guys that your patience will be rewarded. This video might require a rewatch. But first, I think that you need to understand pyrobroin. If you are not aware, this is a made-up substance that Oda introduced in the Sky Islands in Skypiea, and it is related to sea stone. The pseudoscience of it is that these particles, pyrobroin, are released with volcanic activity, so it must naturally exist below ground. It is then ejected into the sky where it interacts with moisture in the air. So basically, pyrobroin formed the Sky Islands. So depending on the density of the moisture in the air determines which kind of sky cloud it becomes. I assume that pyrobroin interacting with actual clouds becomes island clouds, and pyrobroin interacting with general moisture in the air and humidity forms sea cloud. But like I said, Pagya also explains that pyrobroin is a component of sea stone. And this makes a lot of sense because we know that Wano is home to a lot of naturally occurring sea stone, and Wano itself is dominated by a giant volcano. So it's interesting that pyrobroin has this specific interaction with water. When it interacts with the trace amount of moisture in the sky itself, it forms more solid sky, or sky islands. It then stands to reason that water in a more solid form, such as in the ocean, would make for an even more dense substance. But let's not get too crazy too soon. The point of all of this is that I think that pyrobroin is important. It has a relationship with water. Oda created this substance for a reason. It has a part to play in the endgame of the story, as well as in-game world building. So the last thing that I want to say is that pyrobroin and sea prism stone are based on things that actually exist in real life. I'm gonna throw 2 theories at you, neither of which are mine, but I find persuasive and I can work them into a larger idea. I was discussing this concept with Yahweh Theories on Twitter. There'll be a link in the description if you guys want to check out his Twitter, and he told me about ringwoodite. We know for a fact that pyrobroin interacts with and combines with water. So you can think of these sky islands, the sky cloud, the sea cloud, as basically being a storage container for water. The pyrobroin has trapped water into a more substantial state. This is most likely to be the case with sea stone as well. Sea stone which contains pyrobroin. So rather than sky cloud, you can think of a stone which traps water within it. And this brings us to ringwoodite. Ringwoodite is an actual rock that actually exists, and it exists within the Earth's mantle. This rock, the same as we were speculating with sea stone, basically traps water. It is because of this rock's existence and its relative abundance that it is theorized that there's 3 times the amount of water below the surface than exists in the world's oceans. And as an unrelated, possibly fun fact, is the reason that we know about ringwoodite is because it is present in meteors. So just in your mind, imagine, based on ringwoodite, that sea stone traps the ocean. And so this leads to the second theory, which I found mentioned on Reddit. I'll go ahead and include as a link in the description. But essentially, the thing which inspired Oda to create pyrobroin is plastic. There's a really confusing element to when Oda first introduced us to pyrobroin, and that's the fact that the name of pyrobroin actually changed halfway through as Pagya was explaining it. He tells us that there's an ingredient in the clouds and in sea stone called pyrobroin. He then goes on to say particles of keratin are hurled into the sky by volcanoes. So pyrobroin became keratin. And if you're not aware, keratin is a substance that is found, for instance, in our skin. And I say this is confusing because keratin, the word itself translated that way, is only found in the original English Viz translations, because if you go to, for instance, watch the anime, they changed the word so that keratin is no longer there. And it sounds more like scientific and less confusing. But the fact is that if you read the original Japanese words and you translate them, they translate directly as dead skin particles, which leads to a bunch of horrific thoughts we will absolutely get into. But essentially, I think that you can view keratin, which probably possesses pyrobroin, as an organic material. It's carbon-based, similar to life forms. And I think that it's through this explanation that pyrobroin and keratin is best compared to plastics. Plastics are created using fossil fuels, such as natural gas or oil. Fossil fuels are organic, life form-based materials found deep within the earth. If you don't know, coal is literally fossilized trees. Most of the world's oil is thought to have originated from algae. So to re-explain this, right, it isn't pyrobroin that is released from volcanoes, it's keratin. Keratin contains pyrobroin but is not pyrobroin. I believe that you can think of this like natural gas. The natural gas then reacts with moisture in the air in order to form these sky clouds. Basically, these sky clouds are plastic clouds. Likewise, sea stone might be derived from something like oil and is a plastic rock. And I think that you need to understand how diverse plastics really are and how much utility plastics have. Like, we use plastics in so many different forms in present-day society that you would not believe. There is an actual synthetic plastic scientists have created which is just about as hard as diamond. And of course, likewise, there are plastics that are light as the air. And a troubling thing that is occurring is that microplastics are now filling our skies. The potential effects of this are unknown. So it's fitting for Dr. Vegapunk, the smartest man in the world, to essentially have been experimenting as he's experimenting with sea stone. It's basically the equivalent of plastics. So I think that it's finally time for us to do something really cool with the things that we've said. Let's begin with some simple logic. The first time that we were ever introduced to these sky islands, they appeared as a great darkness above. It was actually kind of a big deal because Cricket explained that their clouds has created this darkness. And the strats are like, it doesn't work that way. Clouds don't create darkness. Clouds create cloudiness. But the clouds of the sky island are different. They're too dense. So when they are above you, they literally cast a shadow, leading to total darkness. Guys, right now we're imagining that these sky islands are essentially plastic islands floating in the sky. A common concept with plastics is that they do not degrade naturally. They are not biodegradable. So the plastic is created and essentially it is very, very difficult to ever get rid of it. Likewise, we don't actually know of a reasonable process to destroy the sky islands. And no, Anel's attack of Death Pia is not a reasonable process. We don't know how the sky islands would naturally degrade. So based on what we know right now, I think that it's fair to assume that the sky islands are only growing over time. Volcanic activity occurs, it releases keratin into the air, it interacts with water, more sky islands are formed. The more time passes, the more sky islands there are. And this leads to a potentially interesting doomsday scenario for the world of One Piece, because the sky islands block the sun from reaching the surface. Hypothetically, they may one day cover the entire sky. And when this day occurs, life on the surface is practically doomed. So I don't actually want you guys to think that I believe that this is about to occur in the world of One Piece. However, I want you to keep going with me. This occurring would be very similar to, for instance, if a supermassive volcano went off in the real world. Depending on the severity of this kind of eruption, or if many of them took place simultaneously, the sky would be covered in ash. The ash would then prevent the sun from reaching the surface of the planet, and this could potentially create an ice age. But this ice age wouldn't last forever. The sun is heat, so the sun's rays not being able to reach the surface leads to a winter. However, the earth itself produces heat, and through volcanic activity and other methods, that heat escapes to the surface. So it's possible that the heat essentially gets trapped there on the surface, being unable to escape through these sky islands. So this would lead to a runaway greenhouse effect, similar to what has occurred to the planet Venus. Basically, given enough time, the heat of the Earth will actually warm the surface once again and bring it out of its winter, even while the surface still exists in complete darkness because of these sky islands, covering the entire sky. In fact, it would keep getting warmer for basically ever. So the super long ice age of the surface would eventually transform into boiling hot temperatures. Now, like I told you guys, I don't think that this is a concern for the current world of One Piece. The Sky Islands do exist. The hypothetical, the potential exists that this is the future someday, but it doesn't seem to be any day imminently soon. So you guys ready for the theory? I'm sure you're ready. I don't think that this is about to occur. I think that this has already occurred. I think that the entire world of One Piece that we know is built atop the former Sky Islands, which eventually covered the entire sky. Currently, we know of two seas. We know of the Blue Sea, and we know of Heaven, the White Sea. I think that there is a third sea that reflects hell. It first froze, and then it boiled. This is the Red Sea, or maybe it is the Black Sea, and it exists below the surface. Quite honestly, I think that the existence of this third sea is intuitive, meaning you don't really need evidence to believe it as a possibility. But I actually think that evidence exists. Oda has already drawn it. Guys, have you ever wondered how the holes in Enies Lobby and the hole in Lolosia works? How is it even possible for water to look as if it is draining endlessly into a hole that leads to nowhere? I think that Oda explained it pretty succinctly when Cricket explained the knock-up stream. Oda drew us a picture, and I want you to bear in mind that nobody really knows how the knock-up stream works. This is just a theory. A game theory! Cricket tells us that the going theory is that there's an enormous cavity deep beneath the sea. As cool seawater flows into it, geothermal heat from below creates enormous pressures and steam, resulting in a massive eruption. Cricket is literally telling us that below Jaya, the earth is hollow. There is a cavern. As cool water flows into it, most likely from the hole in Enies Lobby, which is near Jaya, that water boils and is released back up, resulting in the knock-up stream. Guys, if we are literally speculating that a massive freaking cavern exists below the Grand Line that stretches from Jaya to Enies Lobby, this is a massive freaking cavity. It's like almost an entire world. I believe this to be the former world. Water 7 and Wano are foreshadowing. Both of these countries were built atop the ruins of their past civilizations. It's a microcosm of the larger world. The entire world of One Piece is built atop the ruins of the world that came before. I think that observant readers of One Piece will have noticed something that doesn't quite make a lot of sense about the knock-up stream. We believe that cool seawater is entering this cavity, and we believe that this is occurring in Enies Lobby. But then water escapes from the cavity as an eruption through the knock-up stream. So the knock-up stream should leave a hole in the ground. And not just in one location, because the knock-up stream exists in multiple locations. And it occurs 5 times a month. Literally, guys, the knock-up stream pushed half of Jaya up into the air where it landed on the current Sky Islands. So there should be a hole in the ground where that half of Jaya used to exist on the sea. The cavity should have a hole, it should be broken, but that is not the case. Maybe it makes more sense if you view the ground as being a little bit more flexible. Flexible kind of like the Sky Islands and the White Sea. The knock-up stream eruption pushes through the former Sky Islands. But unlike the holes in Enies Lobby and Lolosia and Imu's weapon, the knock-up stream does not destroy them. It simply passes through them. Once the eruption is done, the hole backfills, leaving the seafloor as it was beforehand. Sky cloud from the past. But even more direct foreshadowing might exist. Guys, do you remember the White Strum? This was a white whirlpool that formed at the bottom of the ocean near Fishman Island. This is literally called a white whirlpool. Why is this whirlpool white? And why does it form at the very bottom of the world, as deep as you can go? My thought is that perhaps it contains part of the White Sea or the White Sea, but not from the sky, from underground. How exactly is this getting to the surface? Maybe earthquakes are important. I know that you guys have thoughts. Like, you have thoughts, they've entered your brain, and you're ready for them to be expressed and answered. But we're not going to get lost in the sauce quite yet. It's really interesting to think of this world that exists beneath the surface as hell. For one, you might be able to think of Impel Down as some kind of foreshadowing. The first level of Impel Down is the Crimson Hell, which basically translates to a bunch of people bleeding out. Also potentially fitting that in order to pass from the first level of hell to the second, you have to pass through this ominous hole-looking thing. But in the fourth layer of hell, known as the Blazing Hell, we know it to be hot, but it's hot because they are literally boiling blood. So I bring all of this up to remind you guys that the actual particle that is released from volcanic eruptions, it interacts with moisture or water in the air in order to form sky clouds, is called keratin, directly translated from Japanese as dead skin particles. I'm about to say something that is going to sound really stupid, but after a while it's going to make a lot of sense. So remember, we're pseudoscientifically imagining this place to literally be boiling. I believe that it might be literally boiling with the blood of the dead and the blood of this world's ancestors. There was, at one point in the past, an apocalyptic event leading to the death of everybody who remained on the surface. So the world gets a little taste of this past every time there's volcanic activity, because some of it escapes. It is quite literally blood vapor, or organic vapor, and partly inspired by natural gas, referred to in the real world as a fossil fuel. And it's potentially fitting that Enies Lobby, called the Judicial Island, exists above the hole, supposedly leading down to the Red Sea. I truly wonder if at some point in the past they chucked prisoners down this hole. It was the precursor to Impel Down. So the justice of the time was throwing criminals into hell, which I suppose has not changed. But I think longtime viewers will realize maybe how perfectly this idea fits in to some of my speculations regarding devil fruits. But as a refresher, essentially we've speculated with Smile artificial devil fruits that Caesar Clown literally killed animals. He took the DNA or lineage factor of dead animals, and that was the substance SAD or SAD. You can also think about this substance as soul. DNA, lineage factor, and soul seems to be related in One Piece. The color of SAD is green, similar to how soul is depicted in the story, such as with Brook. So Caesar Clown created this biology-based substance SAD and then gave it to Doflamingo. Doflamingo then pumped the material into fresh water streams within his Smile factory. Trees then absorbed the SAD through its connection with water in order to produce Smile fruits, which as far as we are aware are 100% zones, or animal powers. I believe that what has occurred in the Red Sea is directly responsible for the creation of the actual devil fruits, the real deal. They are called devil fruits because they are made out of the souls of those who died in hell. People with particularly strong willpower or dreams or desires can make fruits that aren't zones. So let's paint this picture in more detail. The way that you should look at the Red Sea is that originally it resembled the surface that we now live on, meaning there was land, but there was also a lot of ocean. That ocean first froze, but then it boiled. But I want to sit here and revisit pyrobroin. Let's do a little trick. You should be familiar with this trick. It's not pyrobroin because the L and R in Japanese are interchangeable. It is actually pyrobroin, which is another way that it is translated. So pyro means fire, brine, which means a salty solution. So I think that pyrobroin was created when the oceans of the Red Sea began to boil. Brine is essentially salt water. Pyro means fire. You can imagine an ocean on fire. This is what inspired Oda to name the substance. However, it isn't that easy. So when the oceans of the Red Sea began to boil, right, what happens when you boil the ocean water? It becomes regular water in a gaseous state or water vapor. So if you boiled the Red Sea, you would not get a brine. You would get just plain water. So let's put some of these things together. Guys, I think that the One Piece world's mythology is similar to actual sailor or pirate mythology. Davy Jones' locker. It is the final resting place of drowned sailors and travelers. Essentially, the bottom of the ocean houses the souls of the deceased. And this also applies to native Japanese mythology as well. They believed that one of the entrances to Yomi was where all of the seas plunged down into the earth. Which makes you think about Enies Lobby, doesn't it? The literal gateway into hell. So I think that thinking about the oceans of the world of One Piece being salt water is inaccurate. Really, the oceans are salt, water, and the souls of the deceased. This is why the ocean acts against devil fruit users, by the way. However, souls in the world of One Piece can be approached more scientifically, and you can call them lineage factors, or DNA. Or maybe you can think of it more colloquially as blood. So the ocean in the world of One Piece is a blood sea. And the original one, the one that exists underground, the Red Sea, is literally boiling. So just like Impel Down, you have essentially boiling blood. Could maybe also call it burning blood. As the ocean began to boil, it leaves the salt behind as deposits. It creates water vapor. Water vapor mixed with the souls of the deceased. This is what I actually think pyrobroin is. So this is a great time to remind you guys that we have speculated that Smile artificial devil fruits are comprised of SAD, which is soul, plus fresh water combined, sucked up by trees. So the combination of SAD plus water is roughly equivalent to pyrobroin. Trees that absorb this material produce artificial fruits, although they are imperfect. And I think that we can guess at least two ways in which they are imperfect. The first is that in the Red Sea, this exists as water vapor. Pyrobroin is a gas, or a steam. This should also make you think about gear second. Blood or soul in water, burning or boiling. When Luffy uses this technique, he loses lifespan. Big Mom with the soul fruit describes taking soul as taking lifespan. So something special happens when you burn blood. That is what I'm saying. But this is all an aside. One thing that I didn't mention about the Smile Factory in the process of creating smiles that is probably important is that they didn't actually use light, natural light from the sun, in order to grow these fruits. They were grown indoors. The ceiling was actually covered with bioluminescent plant life called elegant sunflowers. They are glowing sunflowers. So let's revisit the process of creating the underworld, right? We said this at the beginning of the video, but this all began because sky islands formed continuously for eons and were never destroyed until the sky is completely covered in darkness. It's then natural to assume that people were actually living on the surface before it got truly apocalyptic, as the world steadily got dimmer and dimmer. And I think that it's natural for the people on the surface to want another form of light. So in the sky, they planted Sunlight Eve, which was intended to replace the sun. The way Eve works is that it absorbs sunlight from the sun, which means it would have had to been planted in the Sky Islands. It then transfers that sunlight to its roots, which also supply air to the ocean floor. Basically, guys, Sunlight Eve was the solution to a dying world. It provided light and air to the Red Sea. And this also explains why Sunlight Eve is probably extremely ancient and extremely giant. We know that things that grow in these Sky Islands today grow disproportionately large. This is confirmed because we saw southbirds in Jaya and southbirds living in the part of Jaya that made it up to the Sky Islands. The southbirds in the Sky Islands are much, much larger, as well as the trees and everything else. Most likely the giants were naturally created through whatever process is occurring here in the Sky Islands. And you should absolutely be thinking about Norse mythology. But Sunlight Eve wasn't planted in the Sky Islands that exist today. It was planted in the Sky Islands that exist below. And using these same processes, it has been growing endlessly. Most likely the same is true of Treasure Tree Adam. But of course, eventually the underworld began to boil. Pyrobroin was created, and the roots of Treasure Tree Adam and or Sunlight Eve or another tree began to absorb this soul moisture. I think that you should view their roots as extending below the sky cloud, meaning they'd be observable in the sky of the Red Sea. But in present day, they would be basked in a kind of steam, this blood steam, in combination with the light of Eve, which is the superior version of the elegant sunflowers. You have the creation of devil fruits. So now is the correct time to get lost in the sauce. I want to forewarn you guys, we are not going to dip our toes, we are going to dive in. But as a side note, let me know whether you're a toppings person or a sauce person. And if you don't know what these things mean, you will very soon. Quick viewers will have realized that there is a problem with this theory. Actually, there are a few. The problem is that we need pyrobroin or keratin, which contains pyrobroin, in order to create the Sky Islands. The theory is that this substance is created by boiling the oceans under the ground. So it first requires a burning ocean to create the Sky Islands. This makes sense for the current Sky Islands. It doesn't make sense for the original. So first I want to say that the Sky Islands or Sky Cloud would have been created anyway, even without the burning oceans, simply because we've speculated that it is soul plus water, or blood plus water. So you could imagine that anybody or anything that has ever burned to death from any means that you could imagine would produce a tiny amount of this substance. I just think that it would take an extraordinarily long time in order to coat the sky in sky cloud, given this premise. It's the boiling of the ocean which expedites the process, because the boiling ocean contains the souls of not just the people who have died recently, but the souls of people who may have died over all of history. So if we imagine that there was original sky cloud that exists below our feet, we need some process in order to create it in substantial amounts. I want you to watch my moon piece theory after the conclusion of this one because they are very interrelated. Link in the description. But what you need to understand from that theory is that in the past, over 1500 years ago, there was more than one moon in the sky. There was 6 and one moon had a moon. We see this in the library of Ohara. There is a model, and I speculate that this is the model of the world in the past. Additionally, in that video, we speculate that in the past, for thousands of years, people worshipped the stars and they worshipped the moons, as well as the sun. These were the people's gods. So now let's add on to this idea. I want to paint an even clearer picture of the world as it was more than 1500 years ago, potentially for thousands of years. Before the sky cloud covered the entirety of the sky, the world was separated into three distinct parts. You had the surface of the planet, or the underworld. They utilized the sunlight Eve tree for light and were considered lesser than or demons. You had people on top of the sky cloud. This was like upper society. It was closer to the stars, the sun, and the moons, and therefore was more holy. And then you had the gods themselves living on the moons, which were all habitable worlds except for one. So with this being speculated, you could imagine that the people of the planet at this time would have preferred to live up in the sky rather than on the surface for a number of different reasons. So it's possible that the people of the world at this time intentionally created sky cloud, which you can actually do because we've seen it occur in the present story. Basically, think about the sky islands as prime real estate. More of this was better. Living in the sky was desirable. So creating more sky cloud was potentially a holy process. So of course, based on the premise of this theory, they could have literally boiled the oceans, boiling ocean water. But that isn't as interesting to me as ritual sacrifice. I want you to think about the people of Shandora. Pyrobroin is basically soul plus steam, or blood plus steam, just like Luffy in Gear 2nd, burning blood. The substance keratin directly translates as dead skin particles. So literally burning corpses in a ritual sacrifice would release pyrobroin. I think that Jaya is the clue to all of this, because the people of Shandora's culture is ancient. Now imagine this culture as the prevalent culture of the entire world. How fitting is it that they practiced ritual sacrifice and then found themselves lifted up into the Sky Islands. This is metaphorically related to what happened in the past, because ritual sacrifice created the Sky Islands, or substantially contributed to it. I also want to mention how the Sky Islands being holy would explain how it was steadily developed. They made that a place that could be lived in, which might be the same as what is occurring now. But I don't think that this is enough to explain another problem with this theory, which is that if the world is literally built on top of Sky Island of the past, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because the world as it appears on the surface is very Earth-like, right? There is a lot of actual Earth, which shouldn't exist. So I want to remind you guys that Enel is also of the winged race, which possesses an extremely ancient culture. Enel viewed Verth as holy, and the endless Verth was later explained to us to be the literal moon. Once again, guys, in Moon Piece, we speculate that there was originally 6 moons, 1 moon had a moon. These moons no longer exist in the sky. They were destroyed. Where did they go? They fell to the surface. I think that much of the Earth that we see today is remnants of destroyed moons. But you might be thinking to yourself, well, how does this explain the oceans of the world of One Piece? There's not actually a whole lot of land, but there is a ton of ocean. Where did all this ocean come from? To tackle this, I think that I should explain where scientists currently believe that the actual Earth's oceans came from. And the commonly believed answer to this today is asteroids or meteors. This also relates to something that we said earlier, which is that ringwoodite was first discovered because of a meteor. Ringwoodite, which below the surface of the Earth traps 3 times the amount of water that is currently in the ocean, allegedly. Also remember that the One Piece equivalent of ringwoodite is sea stone. Sea stone, which contains pyrobroin. Pyrobroin, which is soul plus water. Basically, life originated from space is what this theory posits, which is kind of actually what the current scientific community also thinks. So now it is important to say this. The things which comprise asteroids is no different than the things which comprise our planets, including Earth, with rare exception. The Earth really is just a collection of an unbelievable amount of asteroids. It was all made from the same stuff. So where did the water of the blue planet actually come from? It came from the moons, which are essentially incredibly large asteroids. But of course, in this video, we've said a lot of insanely cool things. Is it true? Is it not? We'll find out. It's fun nonetheless. But the premise that we began with, the whole reason to go on this tangent, is what Vegapunk said in the last chapter. So this is a lot of cool thoughts which kind of miss the point, because we need to speculate a mechanism for the world to fall into the sea. So let's back this up a bit. The Sky Islands on the surface today are created from the release of keratin, which contains pyrobroin. So while Sky Island is forming on the surface of the planet now, it is still being formed underground. The keratin being released by volcanoes right now is coming from inside of the planet. So even as the world built on top of the clouds gets heavier, we're then creating more Sky Islands in order to support it, hypothetically. But I do think that there would realistically be a tipping point. The Red Sea is getting hotter. I'm not actually sure if it works this way or not, but I certainly can imagine that the bottom of the sky cloud that exists below the surface is melting. This might actually be the keratin that is being released on the current surface, the breakdown of sky cloud, because it's gotten too hot. With the weight of the world that exists above, it presses down on the Red Sea's space. This would create an insane amount of pressure. I also want to remind you that Sunlight Eve produces oxygen or air at its roots, which would add to this pressure. There's a whole ass atmosphere. So long story short, I could see it as being possible that someday the entire system collapses. Literally the entire world falls back into the Red Sea as the Sky Island cloud below fails. And Vegapunk could actually know about this process because Vegapunk has created the artificial devil fruit that is most similar to actual devil fruits, meaning he might know a lot about the actual Sunlight Eve tree, and through it how the world works. So honestly, this project has gotten to be a bit too much. I think that there's too much that needs to be explained for everything that I had in mind. So I just want to leave you with some spark notes about other things to potentially think about. I think that fresh water versus salt water could be an important concept in determining what becomes sky cloud and also what becomes sea stone. Keratin interacts with moisture in the air in order to produce sky cloud. Moisture in the air is fresh water. Wano, which possesses a lot of sea stone, is basically filling up with fresh water from rains. Likewise, we're essentially speculating that the waters of the oceans, so salt waters, absorb soul, DNA, blood, lineage factor better. Maybe this could be interrelated with the fact that Moria's zombies are weak to salt. Basically, it is important that the Red Sea is boiling because this boiling process is separating the water and the lineage factor from the oceans and the salt. It's also true that the Smile Factory, the creation of Smile Devil Fruits, was utilized freshwater streams. But you guys might remember that we actually began this video speculating that the Grand Line itself is flooding. How might this relate to everything that we're talking about? I literally just brought up Sunlight Eve again, but you guys have already forgotten, haven't you? How does Sunlight Eve work in Fishman Island? The air that the roots produces a bubble of atmosphere, which is why the strats could travel around Fishman Island, not in diving gear. This should also remind you of Sabaody Archipelago, and this makes a ton of sense because Neptune already explained to us that Sunlight Eve is essentially the boss of those kinds of trees. It's a bigger version of the same kind of tree. It's also potentially relevant to know that the bubbles are used to coat ships. That's how we traveled to Fishman Island, but this bubble technology is resistant to an absurd, unrealistic amount of pressure. So I want you to apply this to the Red Sea. The atmosphere that Sunlight Eve is producing forms bubbles. Bubbles that also might be able to survive the pressure that exists underground. I spent a fair few minutes trying to put this into scientific terms in order to explain how this all might work, and I realized that this is a fool's errand. It would simply take too many words, and I could be wildly wrong. But I just want you to think about how these bubbles might be influencing climate around the world of One Piece. Maybe leading to unique surface currents as well as unique water levels. But this allows another connection to become more clear. The bubbles of Sabaody were explained to us to have been created or derived from the tree resin of the mangrove. This was common in theories a few years ago, speculating something different, but guys, resin is plastic. I don't intend to complicate it more than that, but you can think of that as being true. Also, just gonna briefly mention that there's another substance in the world of One Piece that is interesting called amber lead. Amber is also a resin. This is Future JB. While we're here, we might as well go all the way. Amber lead creates a disease which leaves white spots. This happened in Fleavance, known as the White City. The diseased trees in Shandora were also white. The sky clouds the same, obviously. The White Sea and the White Sea. We're speculating that all of these substances are related and contain life force from life. You can call it resin if you want to, and you can relate it to plastics if you want to. So I just want to make sure that this is said, and yes, you should be thinking about Sulong as well as Nika. Perhaps the difference between pyrobroin and keratin is the addition of tree resin, naturally occurring in the Red Sea because of Sunlight Eve. But anyway, guys, I think that's pretty much everything that I had in mind that I wanted to discuss. I might have forgotten something. We'll see. As always, I'm really curious as to what you guys think, and I would love to have a discussion with you guys in the comments about how you see all of this. Can you add on to it? Can you poke holes in it? Obviously, I began recording this video before chapter 1114, and I feel like 1114 actually made this idea even more justified than it was before. He says that the water levels are rising because of earthquakes, and I think that this theory justifies the existence of crazy earthquakes a little bit more than other theories that exist. Like literally the ground that supports the world is unstable. Earthquakes might release water from the Red Sea as steam through holes that are now created because the ground is shifting. But anyway, I'm also aware that hollow earth theories already exist. I have not watched any of them. Honest to God, I don't know what anyone else is saying. I'm pretty confident that what I'm saying here is unique, but this idea of like a world underneath the world is certainly not new. Like Yahweh Theories, who I was talking to, has been speculating this apparently for years. So hopefully I added something to this theory to make it basically a whole new experience, maybe even more convincing than you thought it was previously. But anyway guys, that is all I have to say today. Remember to check out my Moonpiece video if you haven't already. Check out my book, The Booms, link is in the description. Like the video, subscribe, click the bell to be notified, join the squad, and as always guys, have a wonderful day.